He was 27 and finished, though he would not have used that word, when he answered a phone call from a 620 area code he did not recognize. On a Wednesday afternoon in late March, sitting in his car in the parking garage of a tax firm in Chicago, where he had just been told, very kindly, that he was being let go, effective the end of the month. The man on the line said his name was Mervyn Doss, county clerk of Stafford County, Kansas. He said Wesley had inherited something through his mother's people, and that there were back taxes owed and a deadline, and he was sorry to mix the two things in one call. He said it came to $1 and the fees. He said the rest he could not explain on a phone line. Wesley wrote the figure on a parking ticket. By the end of that week, with $1,140 in his checking account and a duffel bag of clothes that would all be wrong for the wind, he had taken possession of a 64-foot wooden country grain elevator on the section line 3 miles north of Stafford. The letters DS still stenciled 10 feet tall down its weathered red side. The cribbed walls were sound. The head house cupola was missing 2 boards. But what nobody knew was that inside the office safe, a Mosler from 1937, with a combination an old man had set and never changed, was something that would change his life forever. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wesley Hartman had been moving toward Kansas his whole life without knowing it, which is a thing easier to see from the end of a story than from the inside of one. He was born in a suburb west of Chicago, the kind of place where the land had been flat once, prairie once, and then had been paved and named and sold in increments small enough that no one ever had to look at the whole of it at the same time. His mother was a Doss before she married. She had grown up in Stafford, in the wheat country of central Kansas, and she had left it at 19, the way young people left it then, with relief, with the certainty that life was elsewhere, in a city, behind glass. She did not talk about Kansas much, but every summer until Wesley was 15, she put him in the car and drove the long, flat hours west to leave him with his grandmother for 2 weeks. And his grandmother lived 4 miles from a grain elevator that had the letters DS stenciled on the side, in paint the color of old brick. His grandmother was a Doss too, by marriage and then by widowhood, and she was the one who took him out to the elevator. Not often. 3 or 4 times across those summers. She would drive the section road south in a Ford that smelled of dust and peppermint, and she would park at the foot of the thing and let him look up at it. He remembered that more than anything, the looking up. The elevator stood at the edge of the section line, the way old elevators stand on the prairie, not placed there so much as grown there. 64 feet from the gravel to the cupola. Wooden cribbed walls, which is to say walls built of 2x6s, laid flat and stacked one on top of the other and spiked through, so that the wall was solid timber all the way through, a foot thick, strong enough to hold the lateral push of 40,000 bushels of wheat without bowing. He did not know any of that at 8. He knew it was tall, and it was quiet, and it smelled, even years after it had gone silent, of grain and creosote and the particular hot dryness that the western plains generate. His grandmother told him the elevator had stopped running in 1979. She told him a man named Edgar Doss had built it, or his father had, she was vague on which, and that Edgar had kept it going long after the railroad stopped sending cars, long after there was any reason to. She said it the way you say a thing you have decided not to feel anything about. Wesley did not ask why. He was 8, and then he was 11, and then he was 15 and embarrassed by the heat and the boredom and the 4 miles of nothing, and he stopped going. His grandmother died when he was 19. His mother sold the house in Stafford and did not go back. And the elevator, which Wesley had not thought about in 8 years, sat at the edge of the section line, going quietly to the county for unpaid taxes, until a clerk named Mervyn Doss looked at the old deed and found a daughter who had moved to Illinois and a grandson with a Hartman last name and a Chicago address. The thing about Wesley's life in the city was that it was not a bad life. That is the part that is hard to explain. He had done everything correctly. He had gone to a good school, taken a degree in accounting because it was solid and his father had approved of it, and he had taken the one elective that did not fit the plan, a single semester of agricultural economics, because the professor was a retired wheat farmer from Nebraska who taught the course like a man telling stories about his own family, and Wesley had liked it, the way you like a window in a room with no windows. He learned to read a USDA precipitation map. He learned what a hundredweight was and a bushel, and why a dry land wheat farmer in western Kansas planned his whole year around 18 inches of rain that might not come. He got an A. He never used any of it. He went to work at a firm on the 14th floor and did corporate returns, and he was good at it, careful and methodical and slow to make a mistake. And he was 27 years old and could not remember the last time he had finished a day and felt that he had done anything that would still matter the next morning. His father had died 2 years earlier, of the heart, suddenly, in the recliner, the television still on. His mother had moved to Arizona to be near her sister. Wesley had a lease and a salary and a 5-year plan in a notes app. And then in one Wednesday afternoon, he had the salary taken away in a glass conference room by a man who called it a realignment. And 40 minutes later, sitting in the parking garage, he had a phone call from a county clerk in Kansas telling him he owned a grain elevator. He sat there a long time. Below him the garage hummed. He looked at the dollar figure on the parking ticket. He thought, with a small, clear part of his mind that had not yet caught up to anything, that he had nowhere in particular to be on the following Friday, and that this was the first time in his adult life that had been true. He called Mervyn Doss back that evening. The clerk had a slow voice, unhurried, the voice of a man in a place where there is no particular reason to rush. He explained it again. The elevator had come down through the Doss line. There had been no will to speak of, only the property reverting, and the county had a tax sale calendar, and the parcel was on it. If the back fees were paid, the title would clear to Wesley. If they were not, it would go to whoever bid at the courthouse steps on the second Tuesday in April, which Mervyn said with a certain dryness was no one, because no one wanted a wooden elevator that had not taken a bushel since the Carter administration. The fees came to $410 and $1 for the transfer. There were 14 days. Wesley asked what he would even do with it. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that has weather in it. Mervyn Doss said, "That's not a question I can answer for you, son, but I'd come look before I decided." He said he had known the elevator his whole life. He said he had known Edgar Doss too. And then he said something that stayed with Wesley on the long drive west, which was, "There's a safe in the office out there. Edgar set the combination in 37, and far as I know, nobody ever opened it after he died. The county never bothered. It's your safe now if you want it." He left 2 mornings later. He told himself he was going to look, that he would drive out, see the thing, pay the fees or not, and be back in Chicago inside a week to start looking for the next firm. He believed this. The lease was paid through April. He had $1,140 and a car that ran, and no one expecting him anywhere. The drive west was long. Illinois rolled into Missouri, rolled into Kansas, and somewhere past Kansas City, the land began to do the thing it does, which is to flatten and open and pull the sky down until the sky is most of what there is. He had forgotten that. He had been a child the last time, looking at it from the back seat. Now he drove into it, with both hands on the wheel, and watched the horizon stop being a line of buildings and become a line of nothing at all, a clean edge between the wheat and the air. And he felt the specific vertigo a person from a city feels the first time he understands how much of the world is empty. The wheat was already up, a hand high, a green so even it looked combed. Centre pivot sprinklers stood in the bigger fields like the skeletons of something. The little towns went by every 10 or 12 miles, each one announced by an elevator first, the elevator visible from miles out, the tallest thing in the county, the way church steeples announce towns in other parts of the country. He understood, driving, that this was a country built around storing grain, and that the elevators were its cathedrals, and that most of them were empty now. He came into Stafford on a Tuesday afternoon, the second week of April, with the wind coming hard out of the southwest, the way it does in central Kansas in April, carrying the smell of new wheat and turned soil and the hot, dry electricity the planes put off when they are getting ready to do something. The town was small, a grain co-op with a cluster of bright steel bins and a tall concrete terminal elevator on the working side of the tracks, the live one, the one that took the modern trucks. A main street 4 blocks long. A courthouse of cut limestone, the color of a soda cracker, square and serious, built in a decade when counties believed in themselves. He found the clerk's office on the first floor. Mervyn Doss came out from behind a counter, and Wesley's first thought was that the man looked carved. He was somewhere past 70. He had been county clerk in Stafford for 31 years, he would say later, and had outlived 2 assessors, 3 judges, and the entire elected school board of 1994. He wore a short-sleeved shirt and a bolo tie and reading glasses pushed up into hair the colour of the limestone, and he shook Wesley's hand and held it a half-second longer than a stranger would, looking at his face. "Doss Eyes," he said. "Your mother's people. I'd have known you on the street." They drove out to the elevator in Mervyn's truck, a faded brown Chevrolet with a county seal peeling off the door and a thermos of coffee wedged against the bench seat. The section road ran straight south out of town. Gravel, dead level, a tunnel of dust behind them. The wind shoved the truck. Mervyn drove with one hand and one elbow out the window and did not say much and let the country do the talking, and the country said the same thing over and over, which was wheat and sky and the occasional windbreak of Osage orange somebody's great-grandfather had planted against the wind in 1930-something. 3 miles north of the courthouse, Mervyn had said on the phone, but it was 3 miles south, and Wesley noticed the slip and did not correct it, because he had begun to understand that directions out here were a thing people carried in their bodies and not in their words. They came over a low rise that was barely a rise at all, the kind of swell in the land you would not notice on foot, and there it was. It stood alone. There had been a town there once, Mervyn said, a siding called Doss, 3 houses and a store and a section line. All of it gone now, back to wheat. The rail pulled up in 81 and sold for scrap, the ties rotting in a fence row. Only the elevator was left. 64 feet of wooden cribbed wall, square, severe, a headhouse cupola on top, leaning very slightly to the east, the way old elevators lean from a lifetime of one-directional wind. The paint was a red that had faded past red, faded to the colour of dried blood, and Wesley would learn later that the red had never been red for beauty. It was iron oxide paint, the cheapest paint there was, the same paint that made every barn in the Midwest the same colour, chosen because it was a few cents a gallon and it kept the weather off the wood. On the side facing the road, 10 feet tall, 2 letters stenciled in white gone grey. DS for Doss, his mother's people. He stood at the foot of it and looked up, and he was 8 years old again, and his grandmother was somewhere behind him in a car that smelled of dust and peppermint, and he had not expected to feel anything at all. Mervyn let him stand there. After a while, the old man said the things a clerk says. The structure was sound, which was rare because most wooden elevators that went out of service either burned or rotted or got pushed over for the salvage timber, the old-growth fur in the cribbing being worth more on the ground than standing. This one had been kept. The roof had held. The cribbing was tight. There was no power to it anymore, the line cut at the pole in '79, and the scale in the driveway was probably seized, and the leg, the long internal belt and bucket mechanism that carried grain to the top, had not turned in over 40 years and might be anything by now. But the bones were good. Edgar had built it to last, and had maintained it like a man maintaining a thing he loved past all reason to. The fees, Mervyn said again, were $410. The deadline was the following Tuesday. He was not going to tell Wesley what to do. He had given up, a long time ago, the habit of telling people what to do with their lives. They walked the ground floor first. Mervyn had the key, a long old key on a wire ring, and the office door was set into the north face, a small square room built onto the foot of the elevator where the business of weighing and recording had been done. The door stuck and then gave. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of paper and grain dust and the particular sweetness a closed wooden space gets after enough decades. A roll-top desk stood against one wall, the slats jammed, a spindle of receipts, a wall calendar from 1979, a feed company's calendar, a pheasant in a wheat stubble. The month never turned past September. A potbelly stove in the corner, a round oak, the cast-iron logo still legible. And against the far wall, squat and black and serious as a small animal, a Mosler safe, the gold lettering on the door rubbed but readable, the dial in the center, a combination lock from a time when a country elevator handled enough cash on a delivery day to need one. Wesley put his hand on the dial. It turned. Stiff, but it turned, the mechanism inside it still alive after 80-some years. Mervyn watched him from the doorway. He said he had a piece of paper somewhere, in the courthouse, a yellow legal sheet that had the combination written on it in Edgar's hand, left with the county when the property reverted. The kind of thing a clerk holds on to without quite knowing why. 42 right, 18 left, 27 right, he thought it was, but he would have to check. He had never used it. The county had no claim on whatever was inside, only on the building and the dirt under it, and the building had not been worth the trouble of opening a safe. Edgar set that combination in '37, Mervyn said, when he bought the elevator off the family of a man who walked off it in the middle of harvest and never came back. Set it and never changed it. And then he died in '89, and far as anybody knows, that door has been shut ever since. Wesley stood with his hand on the cold dial of a safe that an old man had closed before his own grandmother was born, in a wooden room at the foot of a 64-foot elevator on a section line in the middle of Kansas, with the southwest wind pushing at the walls and the light coming low and gold through the one dusty window, and he understood that he was not going to drive back to Chicago on Friday. He could not have said why. He had $1,140 and no job and a lease running out in 3 weeks, and a degree that was good anywhere there was a city, and he was going to spend 411 of those dollars on a building that had not earned a cent since 1979, and he could not have told Mervyn Doss, or his mother in Arizona, or anyone at all what he thought he was doing. Mervyn said he would bring the combination out the next day if Wesley wanted to come back. He said it the way you offer a thing you have been wanting to offer for a long time. Wesley said he wanted to come back. They locked the office and drove the dust tunnel back to town, and Wesley did not look at the safe again, but he thought about it the whole way, the cold of the dial still in his palm, and he knew that the next morning he would stand in front of it, and that whatever Edgar Doss had set behind that door in 1937, he was the one who was going to open it. He paid the fees the next morning, $410 and $1, counted out in the clerk's office, while Mervyn filled in the transfer by hand in a ledger book that the county still kept by hand. That left $729 in his checking account and a building that was his. He bought a sleeping bag and a camp stove and a flashlight at the hardware store on Main, and a week's worth of food at the Co-op grocery, and he drove out to the elevator and spent the first night on the office floor with the door propped because the smell of the closed room was too much, listening to the wind do its work on the cribbing, a long, low complaint of old timber that he would come to know the way you know a sound in your own house. He woke before light. He had not meant to. The planes do that to a person who has only ever woken to an alarm in a room with the blinds drawn. There was no blind. The window in the office faced east, and the sky in it went from black to grey to the grey gold of a Kansas dawn, and he lay in the sleeping bag on the cold board floor and watched it the way you watch something you do not understand. Then he got up and made coffee on the camp stove and carried the cup outside and stood at the foot of the elevator in the cold, with the wind down to nothing, the way the wind drops at dawn on the prairie before it gets up to its day's business. And he watched the light come across 40,000 acres of winter wheat, and he could not, for the life of him, think of a single thing he was supposed to be doing somewhere else. The driveway scale was a Fairbanks, a platform scale set into a concrete pit under the elevator's loading bay, the kind of scale a loaded grain wagon drove onto to be weighed, and Wesley spent that first full day on his back in the pit, cleaning 40 years of dust and mouse nest and rust off the lever mechanism. The scale worked on a system of nested levers and a steel knife-edge bearing, no electricity in it at all, a balance beam in the office that the weight on the platform was telegraphed to through a series of rods. The knife edges were the heart of it, hardened steel ground to a line, and they had to be clean and true or the scale lied. He cleaned them with a rag and a little kerosene from a can he found on the shelf. He did not know yet whether the scale would ever weigh anything again or whether he wanted it to. He cleaned it because it was the thing in front of him and because his hands wanted work the way a dog wants out. By dark, his knuckles were skinned and his back would not straighten, and he had not thought about Chicago in 9 hours. He did not open the safe that first day or the second. He told himself he was waiting for Mervyn to bring the combination, which was true, and he was also, in a way he half understood, putting it off, the way you put off the last page of something. Mervyn came out on the third afternoon. He came in the brown county truck with the thermos, and he had a sheet of yellow legal paper folded in his shirt pocket, soft with handling, the creases gone furry. He did not hand it over right away. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos, and they sat on the loading dock in the sun, with their backs against the warm wood, and Mervyn asked him how the scale was coming, and whether he had found the man lift, and whether he understood what he had. Wesley said he was learning. Mervyn nodded. That was the right answer, apparently. He had been testing, the way the old men out here tested, with questions that were really about whether you would lie about how much you knew. Wesley had not lied. He had said he was learning. The old man took the yellow paper out of his pocket and looked at it a moment and handed it across. The combination was written in pencil in a hand that pressed hard. 42 right, 18 left, 27 right. Below it, in the same hand, a date, March 1937. And below that, 3 words, set off by themselves, that Wesley read twice before he understood they were not an instruction for the lock, but a note left by the man who set it. They said, "For the next one." He went into the office. Mervyn came as far as the doorway and stopped, the way he had the first day, and Wesley understood that the old man considered this a thing he should do alone, and was only there to witness it. The light was good, late afternoon, low and gold through the dusty east window, now that the sun had come around to the west and was throwing its last across the wheat. The safe sat where it had sat since before the war, squat and black. Wesley knelt in front of it. He turned the dial. It was stiff, and then it was not. The wheels inside finding their old positions like a thing remembering itself. 42 right. He went around past 0 once to clear it, the way the old course in agricultural economics had not taught him, but some uncle of the internet had, and brought it slow to 42. 18 left, the long way around and back. 27 right, gently, gently, feeling for the place where the lever wanted to drop. The handle turned. The bolts drew back with a sound like a clock striking once. The door swung open on a hinge that had not moved in 37 years and made almost no noise at all, because Edgar Doss had oiled it the last time he closed it, the way a careful man closes a thing he hopes someone will open. Inside the safe, it was very dark. Wesley turned the flashlight on it. There was no money. That was the first thing, and it took him a moment to understand it, because everyone had told him, in the way a story gets told and retold in a small county, that the safe was where Edgar's money went, that the old man had spent nothing and saved everything, and it had to be somewhere, and here was the somewhere, and there was no fortune in it. There was a leather ledger, thick, the cover gone soft and dark with handling, a strap around it. There was a bundle of newspaper, folded and yellow. There was a small leather pouch, drawstring, no bigger than a fist, that gave off the unmistakable weight of coin when he lifted it, but a small weight, a dozen coins, not a hoard. And there was an envelope, sealed, the paper foxed brown at the edges, with 3 words written across the front in the hard pencil hand he now knew. To whoever finds this. He lifted the pouch first because it was the easiest thing, and because part of him still wanted there to be money. He loosened the drawstring and tipped it into his palm. Silver dollars. 12 of them, Morgan and Peace dollars, dated between 1878 and 1935, dull with age but heavy and real. 12 silver dollars, not a fortune, about what a man could put away in a hard year and mean it. He set them on the desk in a row, and they caught the gold light and held it. He took the ledger out and set it on the roll top and unbuckled the strap and opened it, and here his hands knew what his head had only studied. It was a grain ledger. Wheat received, by date, by wagon, by weight, by the name of the farmer who brought it. Dockage for moisture and foreign matter. Price per bushel, paid out and carried. Rail cars loaded, by car number and date, consigned east. It began in 1947, the ink brown now, but the figures clear, the hand the same hard pencil as the combination, and it ran year by year through harvest after harvest, the columns marching down the pages, the wheat coming in and going out, the price rising and falling, $2.10 a bushel in 51, $1.38 in 68, the whole economy of a place written in a man's careful arithmetic. Wesley turned the pages slowly. He had read 1,000 ledgers in a glass building in Chicago, the ledgers of companies that made nothing and stored nothing and existed only as numbers, and he had never once felt what he felt turning these, which was that every line of it was a true thing that had actually happened. A wagon of real wheat, grown out of real ground by a man with a real name, weighed on the scale he had spent 2 days cleaning. The ledger ran to 1979, and then the entries changed. After 79, there were no more wheat receipts, because the railroad had stopped sending cars and the elevator had gone silent. But the entries did not stop. They became something else. They became weather. Rainfall, recorded by the inch and the date. First frost. Last frost. The day the wheat headed in the fields he no longer bought from. The day the meadowlarks came back. Grain prices at the live co-op in town, written down though Edgar had no grain to sell, as if he could not stop keeping the books of a thing he no longer ran. The entries went on, thinner year by year, through the 80s, in a hand that grew shakier, and the last one was dated in the spring of 1989, and it said only, "Wheat up 4 inches, good stand, wind from the south." Edgar Doss died that summer. Wesley sat with the ledger a long time. Then he opened the envelope. I have read it since in the Stafford County Clerk's archive, where Wesley later placed a copy, the original being too brittle to handle. The pencil is faded to the brown of old blood, and the paper is foxed. But it is legible, and it reads in full, as nearly as I can set it down. To whoever finds this, my name is Edgar Doss. I was born on this section in 1910, and I have lived my life within 4 miles of where you are sitting. I bought this elevator in 1937 from the family of a man who could not keep it through the dry years, and I ran it for 42 years, and I weighed the wheat of every farmer in this end of the county, and I did not cheat a one of them, which is the only thing I will say in my own praise. I had a son. His name was Walter. He drowned in the Rattlesnake in the summer of 1958, the high water year, 14 years old, and I walked off this elevator in the middle of harvest, and I did not come back until the following spring. The wheat that year rotted in the field of every man who depended on me to take it, and they did not hold it against me, which I have never forgotten and never deserved. I came back in the spring because there was nowhere else for a man like me to put his hands. I kept it running until the railroad quit on us in '79, and after that I kept the books anyway, because a man should write down what he sees even if no one has asked him to. I never married again after Walter's mother passed. There is no one to leave this to, so I am leaving it to whoever opens this door. The combination is for the next one. If you have found your way to this section line, then you are the next one, and I will tell you the one thing I know, which is that the work is the point. Not the wheat, not the money. The work and the paying attention and the writing down. The elevator will tell you what it needs if you are quiet enough to hear it. Take care of it. It has stood a long time. Edgar Doss, Stafford County, Kansas. 1988. Wesley folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat in the cold office in the last of the light and did not move for a while. Mervyn was still in the doorway. Wesley had forgotten him. The old man had read it somewhere, sometime. Wesley understood. He had to have, holding the combination all those years. Mervyn said, after a while, in his slow voice, "You all right?" Wesley said he was. He was, in a way he could not have explained to anyone he had worked with in Chicago, who would have wanted to know what the safe was worth. They sat on the loading dock again afterward, in the dusk, and Mervyn told him the rest, the parts Edgar had not written. He told it plain, no sweetness in it, because sweetness was not a thing the old man trafficked in. Walter Doss had been Edgar's only child. The Rattlesnake Creek ran high that June, '58, the wettest spring anyone could remember after the dry decade, and the boy had gone to the creek with 2 other boys, and only 2 had come home. Edgar had been at the elevator, at the scale, weighing the first cutting when they came to tell him. He had finished weighing the wagon that was on the platform. Mervyn said this slowly. Finished weighing the wagon because his father had been there, a boy himself, and had seen it. Edgar weighed the wagon and wrote down the weight, and then he walked out and got in his truck and drove home, and he did not come back to the elevator for 9 months. The harvest came in around him, and there was no one to take it. Some of it went to other elevators 20 miles off, some of it spoiled. And not one farmer in that end of the county said a word to Edgar Doss about it, then or after, because they understood that a man who has lost his only son to the high water is a man you leave alone until he is ready, and that the wheat, which is everything out here, which is the difference between a year and a hard year, was less than nothing measured against it. He came back in the spring. He cleaned the scale, Mervyn said, the same scale you've been cleaning. He weighed the wheat. He kept the books. He did it for 31 more years, the last 12 with no railroad and no grain and no reason, writing down the rain and the frost and the day the birds came back, and people stopped asking him why, because by then everyone understood that the elevator was not a business for Edgar Doss anymore. It was the place he went to keep from going under. It was the work that held him up after the thing that should have taken him down. And he had set a combination in 1937 for the next one, 21 years before Walter drowned, as if some careful part of him had always known the elevator would outlast his own line and would need someone, someday, to find their way to the section line and know what to do. Wesley drove into Stafford the next morning for more food and found that the town already knew he had opened the safe, the way a town like that knows everything inside a day. The woman at the Co-op grocery, May, who had run the bookstore on Main before the bookstore closed and now kept the register at the Co-op 3 days a week, put a jar of canned tomatoes in his sack without charging him, and said her late husband had hauled wheat to Edgar's elevator for 30 years, and that Edgar had never short-weighted a load in his life, and that if Wesley was the one fixing it up, he should have a proper supper now and then, and not live on whatever a man living on a camp stove lived on. She said it gruffly, the way kindness is delivered out there, as a fact and not a favor. A retired wheat farmer named Buddy came out to the elevator unasked 2 days later in a pickup with a toolbox, and looked at the seized leg mechanism for an hour and showed Wesley how the buckets bolted to the belt and which of them were rusted past use, and left a coffee can of bolts the right thread without being asked and without saying much. The librarian, a young woman named Petra, about Wesley's age, called the courthouse, looking for him to say that the library had a microfilm run of the Stafford Courier going back to 1905, and that if he wanted to read about the elevator or about the high water in '58, she could thread the reader for him any afternoon. These were small things. They did not announce themselves. No one made a fuss. But Wesley, who had lived 7 years in a city of 3 million people and could not have named the man who lived across the hall, felt each one land, the tomatoes and the bolts and the offer of the microfilm, and he began to understand that out here a person was accepted not by being welcomed, but by being given small jobs and small gifts that obligated him to stay long enough to return them. May expected her jar back. Buddy would want to see the leg turn. It was a web, and it was closing around him gently, thread by thread, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not want to get out of it. He had been at the elevator 19 days, and his checking account was down to $410, and the wheat in the fields all around him was knee-high and heading out, the green going gold at the tips, the whole county tilting toward the harvest that was 6 weeks off, when the wind changed. He felt it before he understood it. He was up in the head house, 60 feet off the ground, replacing the 2 missing boards in the cupola with cedar Buddy had given him, when the southwest wind that had blown every day since he arrived swung around hard to the south and went still, and the air got the thick green weight it gets, and he looked west and saw the sky doing something he had only ever seen on a screen. A wall of cloud, blue-black at the base, the top of it boiling up white and anvil flat at 30,000 feet, was coming across the wheat from the southwest, and it was dragging a grey skirt of rain and something paler underneath the rain, and the temperature was dropping so fast he could feel it on his arms, and far off, under the wall, he could see the small white flicker of hail. He was 60 feet up a wooden elevator in the open, the tallest thing for 3 miles in any direction, with a storm coming on faster than he had known weather could move, and he started down the man lift with his heart going hard, and he understood, with the cedar boards still in his hand, that he had no idea what a man was supposed to do out here when the sky came for him. The storm broke over the elevator 20 minutes after he got down. He had run the truck under the loading bay and gotten himself into the office, and he stood at the little east window and watched it come, and it was nothing like weather on a screen. The hail came first, ahead of the rain, pea-sized and then marble-sized, hammering the cupola 60 feet up and bouncing white off the gravel of the driveway. And the wind behind it hit the elevator broadside, and the whole 64 feet of it groaned and took the blow and did not move, because Edgar Doss had built it of foot-thick cribbed timber to stand exactly this. And then the rain came in a grey wall that erased the wheat field 40 feet from the window, and it was over in 11 minutes. The sun was out before the gravel stopped steaming. The wheat was beaten flat in a swath where the worst of it had crossed, and would stand back up in a day or two, mostly, the way young wheat does. The elevator had lost nothing but the temper of a man who had thought he understood weather. Buddy came by that evening to check on him, having seen the cell go over from town, and found Wesley sitting on the loading dock, looking at the washed sky, and said only, "First one's always the worst," and did not explain whether he meant the storm or the fear, and Wesley understood that he meant both. The restoration took the rest of that year and into the next. He did it in the order the building asked for, which is to say, the order Buddy and the structure between them dictated. The roof and the weather skin first, because everything else was downstream of keeping the rain out. He replaced the missing cupola boards and then went over the whole headhouse roof, which was old galvanized steel, 16 gauge, the seams opened in a dozen places, and he learned to seal a standing seam with a hand seamer and a tube of butyl, working 60 feet up on a day with no wind because Buddy would not let him go up otherwise. He scraped and primed and painted the south and west faces, the weather faces, 2 coats of the same iron oxide red, because May said the elevator should look like itself and not like something a city person had gotten hold of. And she was right, and he found he agreed with her before she had finished saying it. He rebuilt the leg, the long internal belt with its steel buckets that carried grain from the dump pit to the top, replacing the rotted belt with one he ordered from a co-op supply in Hutchinson, and bolting on the buckets from Buddy's coffee can. And the first time he turned the head pulley by hand and watched the buckets march up the dark shaft and come over the top, Buddy was there, and the old man watched it and nodded once and said, "There she is." And that was all, and it was enough. He got the scale weighing true again. That was the work he was proudest of, because it was the most exact. A platform scale lies in small amounts long before it fails outright, and the only way to know is to test it against a known weight, and there is a set of certified test weights the state keeps for exactly this: 50-pound cast iron blocks, and the county weights and measures man, who had not had reason to drive out to the Doss elevator in his entire career, came out with them in the back of a state truck, and they tested the scale across its range, and it read true to within a pound at 4,000, which the man said he would not have believed of a Fairbanks that had sat dead for 40 years, and which made Wesley happier than any number on any return he had ever filed. He oiled the knife edges. He squared the balance beam. He kept by then his own ledger. That is the part I want to be careful about, because it is the heart of it, and it is the easiest thing to make sentimental, and Edgar Doss would not have stood for sentiment. Wesley started a ledger his first full summer, a new leather book from the stationer in Hutchinson, and he began it the way Edgar's later years ran, with weather, because there was no grain yet to weigh. Rain by the inch and the date. First wheat heading, which came in the second week of May. The day the meadowlarks came back, which he had to ask Buddy to identify. A clear falling whistle from the fence wire, and Buddy said they'd been back 2 weeks already, and where had Wesley been? And Wesley wrote down the date Buddy gave him, and noted in the margin that he had missed it, because Edgar had taught him through the ledger that you write down the truth, including the part where you were not paying attention. First killing frost, late September, a Tuesday, the wheat stubble white at dawn and the meadowlarks gone south overnight. He kept it in the same office, on the same roll-top desk, beside the older ledger under glass, and the 12 silver dollars in their pouch, in the safe with the door now standing open, because the safe had given up what it held, and there was no reason to close it again. I have stood in that office at 6 in the morning, with the older ledger open under the glass, and the new one open beside it in Wesley's hand, and the two hands 40 years apart, recording the same section line, the same wheat, the same birds, and it is the closest thing to time travel I know of that does not require believing in anything. I went out there to verify a date, the date of the high water in 58, which the Courier microfilm in the Stafford Library puts in mid-June, the 11th or the 12th, the column smudged. The oral history in town says June. Edgar's letter says summer. I trust the Courier, but only by a little, because the man who set the type was working from the sheriff's report, and the sheriff was working from grief, and grief is not a careful witness to dates. There is a thing worth understanding about why the elevator went silent, because it is not the thing people assume. They assume drought, or the Dust Bowl, or the slow death of the small farm, and all of those are real, and all of those are in the story, but they are not why this elevator stopped. It stopped because of a railroad timetable. Wooden country elevators like Edgar's were built every 6 or 8 miles along the branch lines in the wheat country between about 1900 and 1930. One for each siding, because a farmer with a wagon could only haul grain so far in a day, and the elevator's whole reason to exist was to gather the grain of one township and load it onto the cars that came down the branch. When the railroads consolidated and pulled up the branch lines through the 1970s and 80s, deregulated and free to abandon unprofitable track after the Staggers Act in 1980, the cars stopped coming, and an elevator with no rail siding is a 64-foot box with nothing to load grain into. The grain went instead to the big concrete co-op terminals in the towns that kept their rail. The live one in Stafford that Wesley had seen on his first drive in, and the country elevators went dark, one siding at a time, all across the plains. There are only a few hundred of the old wooden country elevators still standing in the wheat states today, by the best count anyone keeps of the many thousands that once stood, and the number falls every year because each one that comes down for its salvage timber does not come back. Edgar's is one of the ones still up. Wesley means for it to stay one. He did not get rich. I want to be plain about that, because this is not a story about a man who found a fortune in a safe, though the town will tell you for years that he did, the way towns prefer their stories. The 12 silver dollars were worth, melted, a few $100s, and a little more than that to a collector, and Wesley did not sell them. The elevator earns a little now, in pieces, the way a careful life out there is assembled out of pieces. The Kansas State Historical Society in Topeka, the people who keep the record of the state going back to 1875, sent a preservation specialist out to document the structure, one of the most intact wooden cribbed wall country elevators left in the central wheat belt, and there is a small grant attached to keeping it standing and open. The county extension office took Wesley on half-time, because a young man who can read a USDA precipitation map and keep a clean ledger is worth something to an office that serves 400 farms, and the work pays for his keep. Petra at the library had him write a column for the Courier once a month about the elevator and the records and what the old ledger says about a year that everyone has forgotten, and a few people far away found the columns online and wrote to him in the way people write when something has told them a true thing, and there is a little money in that too. He is not rich. He is, in his own phrase, taken from the older ledger without quite knowing he had taken it. Enough, carefully kept. The community closed around him the way May's first jar of tomatoes had promised it would. He returned the jar full of his own beans, badly canned the first year, better the second. Buddy comes out most weeks, and they turn the leg and grease the head pulley and complain about the wheat price, which Buddy has complained about every year of his life, and which Wesley now complains about too, having a stake in it. Sully, a retired carpenter who had stayed away the first months, the way the older men stayed away, came out one full day with a truckload of seasoned oak and helped Wesley rebuild the office floor where the boards had gone soft under the safe, and refused payment beyond supper and the use of the stove, and told Wesley, working, that he had hauled wheat to this elevator as a boy, and that Edgar Doss had once given him a quarter for sweeping the driveway, and told him to put it somewhere safe, and Sully had, and still had it, a 1949 quarter in a drawer at home, and he did not say anything else about it, but Wesley understood that this was Sully's way of telling him the elevator had always been the kind of place that gave a person something to keep. A year turned, and then most of another. The wheat headed and gold and was cut, the great green combines crawling the section at the live co-op's harvest, while Edgar's elevator stood by and took nothing, which was all right, because it was not for taking wheat anymore. It was for keeping the record. The meadowlarks came back in April, and Wesley wrote it down on time that year, having learned to listen. The first killing frost came in late September, and he wrote that down too. The tumbleweeds broke loose in November and stacked against the west fence the way they had stacked against it for 100 years, and he cleared them and wrote down the day he cleared them because Edgar had written down the day he cleared them every year for 40 years, and Wesley had come to feel that the ledger was a conversation he was now on the near side of. I asked him once, out on the loading dock in the dusk, with the wind down the way it goes down at dusk, what he thought he had been looking for that Wednesday in the parking garage in Chicago when he took the call. He thought about it a long time, in the way he thinks about everything now, slowly, the city quickness gone out of him. He said he had not been looking for anything. He said that was the whole trouble with how he had been living, that he had a 5-year plan and a salary and a lease, and not one thing he was looking for, and that the elevator had not been an answer to a question he was asking because he had not been asking any. He said the old man's letter had it right. The work is the point. He keeps the brass tag from the safe, the railroad consignment tag with Edgar's number stamped in it, on the windowsill of the office where the morning light comes in, and he keeps one of the silver dollars in his pocket, a Morgan dated 1878, the oldest one, and he turns it over with his thumb when he is thinking, the way another man might worry a coin in a city he has never been to and never will. He told me the thing he comes back to is the wagon Edgar finished weighing, the morning they came to tell him his son was drowned. Wesley said he used to think that was the saddest thing in the story, a man finishing the arithmetic while his world ended. He does not think that anymore. He thinks it was the truest thing in it. He thinks Edgar weighed the wagon because the wagon was real and in front of him, and the weight was true, and writing it down was the one thing in that moment a man could actually do, and that everything Edgar did for the 31 years after, the silent elevator and the kept books, and the combination set for the next one, was the same act repeated. You weigh what is in front of you, you write down what is true, you take care of the thing that has stood a long time, and someday, without your knowing it, someone finds their way to the section line and opens the door you oiled before you closed it, and they are the next one, and the record goes on. Some elevators go silent and stay silent. Some go silent and wait. The Doss elevator stands tonight on the section line 3 miles south of Stafford, Kansas, the cupola leaning very slightly into 100 years of southwest wind, the scale weighing true, the safe open, the ledger lying on the roll-top desk in a young man's careful hand, and it is not waiting for anything anymore. It was found. He answered the call.